last 30 years, the forces of autocracy
принято решение о проведении специальной военной
The
операции.
Russian army is committing barbaric actions.
Welcome to lecture number 11 in our mini-series on understanding the war. And today we'll be tackling a subject which is perhaps a little bit outside the box. And it is the notion of what the rest of the world thinks about the conflict. And I say this very much with an open mind and some research in the background. And I'll start again by giving a little bit of an introduction and then 3 points and then a conclusion. Now, by way of introduction, I think that there is a misconception in Europe and the United States that the ongoing conflict and war in Ukraine is basically about Russia versus the West, however we define that. It's not. It's actually much broader than that. It's also about the world order, which will be subject to our last lecture, number 12, but it is about the West and the rest. So it has much broader ramifications. And I base my thesis today on the fact that I'm the chairman of the board of Martti Ahtisaari's CMI Peace Foundation. I have the privilege of being on the board of Bono's One Campaign and the board of the Crisis Group. So I have an opportunity to talk with a lot of friends and experts around the world which look at this conflict beyond Europe and the United States. And as always, just keep in mind that when you have a war close to yourself or close to where you live, it is much more, or it feels much more real, and therefore your reactions are going to be different. So the way in which I'm going to look at things today is number one, the reaction of the West, number two, the reaction of the outside, and number three, the specific regional reactions to the war. And the thesis is today basically a warning that please try to avoid being too Eurocentric about this. The war looks different from outside of Europe and North America. So here we go. First, the West. Now, you'll remember the vote that took place in the UN in the early days of the war. Basically, we had 141 states condemning Russia, 35 abstaining, and 4 in favor. Now, in the West and in Europe, we rejoiced and thought this was great. This basically shows that Russia is in the wrong and we are in the right. I think it's a fallacy or a simplification to think like that. And here's the reason. First of all, I think the 141 votes were actually soft. Not everyone was 100% sure that this is the right way to go, but for various reasons of sometimes interest, sometimes values, sometimes solidarity, they voted against Russia and therefore in favor of Ukraine. But secondly, many people did not realize that the 35 votes that abstained actually represent over half of the world's population. So we're looking at countries like India and China and say South Africa. And there's a reason why they abstained. It will vary, but the bottom line is there's a message. Now I'm parking aside the 4 that voted with Russia because I think they're rogue states, North Korea, Eritrea, Syria, and Belarus. But this sort of mass in the middle is something that the West needs to take seriously and understand. Now, the reason that many of us are baffled is that some say that, well, this is not about values, this is about a rules-based world order. Yes, perhaps, and I fully agree. On one hand, it's about values, that you're not allowed as a big aggressor to attack and kill anyone. But at the same time, it's about a rules-based order which is linked to the UN, the United Nations, and its charters, and of course the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, which has a lot of language and treaties ever since the Helsinki Accords of 1975, talking about territorial integrity and sovereignty and keeping the borders that exist. So the idea that we in the West and the rest of the world should understand that the nation state in question has the right to choose what kind of borders it actually has. So the reaction of the West is values and a rules-based system, and the rest of you should follow us. But it's not that simple. And here we come to point number 2 and the reactions from the outside. And just because I say that things look different from the outside doesn't mean that I personally agree. Most of the time I don't. But I listen to what my friends have to say around the world. One of the approaches that I've heard is that, hey, listen, this is your war, not our war. You deal with the mess. And in any case, most of the wars in this world, big ones especially, have started in Europe. In this one, we are not party to this war, but there will be ramifications. The ramifications are about higher food prices, higher energy prices, inflation, and a possible economic downturn. So deal with this mess, but don't expect us to take party of it, because we will suffer in any case. Then there is also a question which I would frame as saying that it's not an indifference to the world and the war and human suffering, but it is a question of loyalties and also a question of resentment. Here is where the West needs to understand that different countries and different continents look at this war from a different perspective. Some of them look at it from the perspective of colonialism. In other words, Western powers in the 20th century dominating, often aggressively and in an imperialist manner, different parts of the world. Secondly, it's about the debate that we're having on climate change. Basically saying that, listen, you, the West, are the original polluters. We, the rest, say the global South, are suffering because of what you have done. Don't expect any sympathy from our side. It's also about the way in which the West has dealt with COVID and vaccine distribution. Some people see it, rightly or wrongly, that the West has been extremely selfish with COVID. It's also, fourthly, about asylum, this sort of notion of indifference. And also, I'll be very frank with you, this sort of juxtaposition that, Europe, are you now opening your borders because the asylum seekers are Ukrainian? Whereas you didn't do that in 2015 when they came from other parts of the world. So please be consistent, is the thinking that I hear from a lot of my friends. And finally, there's also this notion of institutional representation that I will deal with later, that the world order basically and institutions have been created pretty much in the image, if not of the winners of World War II, at least the West. So there is this sentiment that, this resentment that, listen, deal with your own war and look at yourself in the mirror. There's also this sentiment, that this is very important, of hypocrisy, right? That, listen, you in the West, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Now, I'm not into whataboutism, but the reaction is quite often that, listen, why is, for instance, the United States not a member of the International Court, ICC? Or, well, Russia and China for that matter either. Or why did you attack Iraq? Or what was your thinking on borders in Africa during colonialism? You didn't exactly think about territorial integrity. So what we have to understand in the West is that the rest of the world is not 100% with us in this war. And there is a reason. And we have to understand it. We don't have to agree, but we have to understand it and hopefully do something about it. And here is where I come to my third point about the actual reactions. Now, obviously, we have 200 more or less countries or nation states in the world, so I'm not going to be able to give a razor sharp assessment on all of them. I can just give you a superficial overview of continental thinking. So let's start with one of the most important ones, Africa, and especially the African Union. And remember that if you look at closeness and support, African Union, the European Union are usually very close to each other. But the thinking here is, again, the reason why there's not indifference but a distance is that there are a lot of non-aligned thinking in the African Union and among African countries. There are also historical things linked to colonialism, also to alliances actually during the Cold War, and to be honest, cooperation with Russia as well. So it's not as clear on the ground as you would think. Secondly, Latin America. Here probably a slightly more sort of split. So a majority of Latin American countries have condemned obviously what Russia did, and a majority of them are supporting Ukraine and condemning Russia. But there is a minority in Latin America that thinks that, listen, this is about NATO and Russia. Again, rightly or wrongly, all I'm saying is that this type of thinking exists. Thirdly, I'll just take India as a special case because it's the second largest country in the world in terms of population, 1.3 billion, more or less. Now, India is a member or part of the Quad, which is basically an alliance between the United States, India, Australia and Japan. That's all well and good. But you see, India is also the biggest exporter of arms from Russia. And it has a traditional tie to Russia, former Soviet Union as well. So that's the reason that it abstained in the UN and hasn't clearly condemned or taken a stance in the conflict. Then fourthly, the Middle East, of course, extremely complex, but suffice it to say that it's about alliances, it's about Israel and Palestine, and it's about energy. That's why you've seen different types of reactions coming from different types of states in the Middle East and in the Gulf region. Finally, and fifthly, Asia. I mean, we've had a long conversation about alliances and especially about China's reaction in a specific episode, but you will get variable and flexible approaches to the situation. Some countries staying at bay, other ones like, say, Japan and South Korea supporting Ukraine. So here, again, the importance is to understand that there is a variation between the reactions coming from around the world to the war. And let me then conclude with the following. Point number one, I want to warn against Eurocentrism. That we look at this conflict only in terms of Russia versus the rest or Russia versus Europe. It is also about the West versus the rest. Number two, you have to understand that Russia is not completely isolated globally. Yes, it's isolated from its biggest trading partners like the United States and Europe, but it is not isolated completely, nor has it been condemned 100%. So what I suggest is, number three, that we in the West step back, learn our lessons, and reflect about why the rest of the world is not as harsh on Russia at the moment as we are. Now, this is, in my mind, not about picking sides, but is it perhaps about a time that we need to sit down and talk about what a emerging world order might look like, and that's exactly what I'm going to do in our last lesson, number 12, on the world order. But these were my thoughts about the West and the rest.
Over the last 30 years, the forces of autocracy
Принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
The Russian army is committing barbaric actions.